Hi, welcome. This is a brief talk about facilitating reading in the classroom through supporting executive functioning of students. There are two goals to this presentation. The first is understanding what executive functions are and how they relate to reading. And the second is understanding how we can support executive functioning in our students in the classroom to facilitate reading. And these tips and understanding can be used to support all students and especially those who are having difficulties. So our first question is, what are executive functions? What is executive functioning? There are three core skills and abilities involved in this, and they all work together to contribute to complex, planned, goal-oriented behavior. The three core skills are inhibition, working memory, and cognitive flexibility. Inhibition refers to that self-control and resisting temptation, staying on task, suppressing responses that are not relevant to what we're doing. Working memory involves not only holding information in our memory, but holding it in a way where we can manipulate it, change it around, and work with it. Finally, cognitive flexibility is our set shifting. It's how we can adjust to new rules, changes in priorities, or perspectives. Other abilities involved are motivations, emotions, and social functioning. And none of these things are mutually exclusive. They all work together to contribute to our complex, goal-oriented behavior. You yourself may know some of these examples, these classic experimental examples in tests of executive functioning, and as adults, we have trouble with these. The image on the left is from a task called the Stroop task, where the person, instead of reading the word, has to say the color that the word is written in. So for example, that word yellow in the top left, you'd have to say blue because it's written in blue. And you have to inhibit the reading of the word, which is really hard to do, even as an adult, even presenting this, having practiced it. The image on the right is from a video you may have seen where people are instructed to watch the basketball team in the white shirts and count how many passes the team makes. And many adults who see this miss the moment where a gorilla walks into the middle, does a little dance, and walks out. So executive functions by nature are hard. They take a lot of work and mental resources. They're kind of the opposite of doing things in an automatic way. So now that we know what executive functions are, we can talk about how exactly they're related to language. So there are a lot of ways that executive functioning is related to reading, and I'll get into some of them on the next slide. But what I really want to get across in this presentation is that executive functioning as a way to engage in complex, planned, and goal-driven behavior, as a resource, executive functions are limited. They are not infinite in their capacity. To explain this, I'm going to borrow an idea from my chronic illness folks called Spoonie theory. And the idea behind this theory is that for every day that you start out, for every reading task that you do, you have a limited and a finite number of spoons or of resources. So every time you add a level of complexity, of task demand, of distraction, of inhibition, of whatever onto a reading task, this means that it's going to cost the student more spoons. And reading itself is a pretty spoon-heavy behavior because you not only need to understand the letters, how they relate within their own word, you have to understand the meaning of the word itself, how the word fits in with the words beside it, how the words fit into a sentence, how the sentence fits into the sentences beside it, and how all of these things fit into the paragraph and the whole overarching story itself. That's a lot of spoons. And if someone is having trouble with reading, or if they have a developmental language disorder, it's going to cost them even more spoons. And the same thing will be true in a case where someone is having deficits in their executive functioning. And we can see this play out in a lot of research studies. Sikora and colleagues demonstrated that children with executive function difficulties score lower on all areas of executive functioning. When they looked at inhibition specifically, what they did was present a distractor word before having children complete a picture description task. And they found that in children with a language impairment, that the distractor task had a significantly larger effect. So because reading and this verbal language task was more difficult for these children with a language impairment, they were using more spoons, so they had less spoons left over to engage in this executive function behavior of suppressing the distractor word. Cognitive flexibility is also related to reading. Cartwright and colleagues demonstrate that cognitive flexibility in relation to smooth and fluent reading of individual words and text passages. And they explain this in a way where readers need to shift their attention from engaging in the behavior of decoding the different parts of the word and sentence to comprehending the greater meaning. So they're engaging in that task switching, which we know is difficult. Task switching, especially on a trial-by-trial basis, Gupta and colleagues demonstrate, is difficult for typically developing children up until age 7 to 9. So even in children who don't have a language impairment or difficulty reading or who are poor comprehenders, task switching and doing these kind of mental operations is difficult. So it's unsurprising that all of these mental tasks are related to reading and reading comprehension. I like this study by Nowens and colleagues who tested fourth grade students on their executive functioning skills, which you can see on the left, and then tested those same students a year later in fifth grade for decoding, language, and reading comprehension skills. The researchers used this statistical technique. It's called structural equation modeling, but basically they were able to demonstrate all of these relationships that you can see in the diagram here. And what's important here is you can see that the elements of executive functioning on the left are both directly related to reading comprehension in the orange arrows and indirectly related to reading comprehension and reading skills, as you can see in the blue arrows. So we know that executive functioning is related to our reading abilities and also predicts later reading abilities. So it's our so what time. So we know that this relationship exists. Now we want to think about how do we support executive functioning in our classroom to facilitate reading and to make reading itself cost less spoons in total. And the way to do this is to give students spoons or to make them have to spend less of their spoons. So if we're thinking about specifically inhibition and executive functioning, we want to make sure we're giving students clear instructions and you're not saying anything that they're going to have to suppress, and the instructions are very relevant to the task. We also want to make sure we're giving our students frequent reminders of what we're doing. Oh, sorry about that. We want to make sure we're giving our students frequent reminders about what they're doing so that they don't have to keep remembering things and they don't have to suppress the temptation to switch off task. We can also facilitate executive functioning through changes in the environment. We know that even in infants, there's this instinct to reach out to things that are tempting. So visually putting away anything that's unrelated is going to make it easier, and it's going to take less spoons for students to suppress irrelevant information and really stay on task. If we're thinking about working memory, we want to make sure we're giving students the opportunity to prepare. So this can look like going over vocabulary before you do the lesson, or sending a sheet home with parents so they can kind of pre-learn the concepts. And this takes some of the spoon load away from the student, in that they don't have to learn a whole bunch of new vocabulary in addition to performing this reading comprehension task. Giving students the opportunity to repeat the lesson, repeat instructions, and giving students the opportunity to rehearse and repeat that rehearsal is also going to facilitate executive functioning support for reading comprehension. Having directions presented in multiple modalities, so whether that's auditory instructions, written instructions, picture instructions, all of these things are going to make it easier and make reading cost less spoons for students. Finally, if we're thinking about cognitive flexibility in this spoony theory, we're going to make sure that we're giving tasks in order, in a very thoughtful order. So we know that doing two things that are really similar, of course, that there's going to be some confusion and it's going to be really hard to switch between those two tasks. But if you do two tasks in a row that aren't that similar, understandably, it's a lot easier to switch between those two. When you are switching tasks, a way to facilitate executive functioning is to give notice to students and allow them to kind of, internalize and take a second and realize and give their mind a chance to pack away the first task before they open the next one. And giving lots of cues that are accessible, whether that's a reminder on the page, a verbal reminder often, a reminder on the board, that's also going to help students remember, okay, no, we're not doing that task we did before. We've switched to a new one. And I know this is a lot. This is a lot of complex planning and goal-directed behavior. And us as adults, executive functioning can be hard and effortful. So just keep that in mind when you're working with your students who maybe have those difficulties. We know that executive functions are hard, but if we think about it in this way where it's a limited resource and a way we can make students have more spoons for themselves at the end of the day, we can make it easier for them. Thanks.